My name is David North. I'm the chairperson of the International Editorial Board of the World Socialist website. Just 1 week ago, on November 3rd, the Socialist Equality Party held a webinar titled The American Earthquake, Election Day 2024 and the Fight Ahead. The election is now behind us, and we are experiencing the aftershocks. The election of Donald Trump, the first fascist president of the United States, is the culmination of the protracted crisis of American democracy. Almost a quarter of a century ago, the Socialist Equality Party stated that the Supreme Court's ratification of the theft of the 2000 election and the Democratic Party's passive acceptance of George Bush's accession to the presidency meant that there did not exist within the American ruling class a significant constituency for the preservation of democracy. 4 years ago, on January 6, 2021, Donald Trump attempted to overturn the results of the 2020 election by staging a coup in Washington, D.C., and seizing control of the Capitol. It failed, not because of resistance from the Democratic Party or any other section of the state, but because of the inexperience of the right-wing mob assembled by Trump. In the immediate aftermath of the failed coup, President Biden proclaimed that he wanted to preserve a strong Republican Party. Biden's wish has been fulfilled. Not only has Trump regained the presidency, the Republican Party will control both the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Supreme Court, whose ranks include co-conspirators in the January 6th coup, ruled in advance of the 2024 election that there exist no restraints on the exercise of presidential power. Trump is effectively above the law and can do anything he likes, which includes murdering his political opponents. Prior to the election, Biden and Kamala Harris repeatedly warned that Trump represented an existential threat to American democracy. The F word, fascism, featured prominently in the pre-election discourse. What a difference 5 days makes. The F word has been preemptively sent back into political exile. Now that Trump has won the election, forgive and forget is the new motto of the Democratic Party. There is no political ceremony more sacred to American democracy, Biden proclaims, than the peaceful transfer of power, even when the recipient is a fascist who had been preparing a second and more violent coup in the event that he lost the election. It should be recalled that Hitler's elevation to the office of German Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, was also a peaceful transfer of power. The violence came afterwards. Now, it is not the position of the SCP and the WSWS that the accession of Trump to the presidency is the equivalent of Hitler's 1933 victory. The United States is not Weimar Germany, and the transformation of the United States into a police state dictatorship backed by a mass fascist movement will not, whatever Trump's intentions, be achieved overnight. There will be struggle, enormous struggle, but it would be politically irresponsible and actually contribute to the success of Trump's aims not to recognize the dangerous implications and real consequences of last Tuesday's election. At the very least, it is necessary to take Trump at his word, to accept that when he stated that this election would be the last, that he would rule as a dictator from day one, that he will deport millions of immigrants, and that he will eliminate political opposition, Trump meant what he said. The purpose of today's meeting is to analyze the November 5th election, to explain what happened and why it happened. The focus of this analysis, a Marxist analysis, will not be on Trump, but on the class forces and interests that have found expression in this election. The essential premise of our analysis is that the coming to power of the second Trump administration signifies a fundamental realignment of the American political superstructure, long in preparation, corresponding to the real social relations that exist in the United States. The fundamental social fact to which the Trump presidency will give political expression is that 800 billionaires in the United States have a combined wealth of $6.22 trillion. The existence of this oligarchy, exercising virtually limitless economic control over the United States economy and pursuing a ruthless domestic and global imperialistic agenda, is incompatible with democracy. Facilitated by the bankrupt policies of the Democratic Party, pitched to the affluent middle class at the expense of the working class, this election has resulted in the Trump victory, facilitating this realignment, realizing this realignment. What we are engaged in today is a necessary political autopsy to give the corpse of the Democratic Party the burial it deserves and to proceed to build a mass movement of the working class based on an international and anti-capitalist program. As I said, enormous struggles are on the agenda. The Democratic Party, as is its wont, is gazing on the posterior of Donald Trump. As the saying goes, force not only conquers, it convinces. There is no doubt great confusion within the working class. Millions of workers voted for Trump, but as we will explain, they voted for Trump not because they want his dictatorship, but they are seeking an answer to the enormous problems, economic and social, with which they are confronted. They don't want war. They don't want genocides. And Donald Trump, in the default of a significant or serious opposition to from the Democratic Party, exploited these frustrations. But the working class is going to make an experience with Donald Trump and all that he represents. The fight will come. But that fight must be prepared. It requires analysis. It requires a sober and careful approach to political events. The last thing it needs is panic and hysteria. That's not what we are presenting today. It's necessary to think, to evaluate. The time for serious politics has begun. And so to initiate this process, we are going to have a panel discussion which will be based on three very important reports that will be given. First, there will be a broader political introduction by the National Secretary of the Socialist Equality Party, Joe Kishore, who was also the presidential candidate of the SEP in the election. He will be followed by Eric London, who will explain the internal dynamics of this election, what was revealed by the vote itself. Tom Carter will examine the specific threat to democratic rights represented by the incoming Carter administration. And Jerry White, who was the vice presidential candidate of the SEP, will examine the developing class struggle and what it signifies in the weeks, months, and years ahead. So with that, I would like to turn the discussion over to my comrade, Comrade Joe Kishore. Comrade Joe.
Thank you very much, Comrade David. As indicated, I will try to give a summary of the political issues following on that introduction and introducing the three very important reports which will be given today. Now, the re-election of Trump is a political shock to millions of people in the United States and throughout the world. Less than 4 years ago, Trump attempted to violently overthrow the 2020 elections. And now this fascist demagogue has decisively won the 2024 election with both the Electoral College and the popular vote majority. This meeting will be an initial review of the causes of Trump's victory and its implications. The reports will present in detail the vote last week and what it shows, as well as the plans of an incoming Trump administration. I just want to stress a few points. First, the coming to power of a second Trump administration cannot be understood in relationship to merely the personal attributes of Trump and the Republican Party. It has to be related, as David noted, to the structure of American society and the escalating crisis of American and global capitalism. In its initial statement on the election of Donald Trump, the World Socialist website wrote, quote, "However it was achieved, and this is not to minimize the political complicity of the Democratic Party, the coming to power of a second Trump administration represents the violent realignment of the American political superstructure to correspond with the real social relations that exist in the United States. American capitalism is dominated by an oligarchy, which controls the entire political system. 800 billionaires have a combined wealth of more than $6.2 trillion. There are now more than 12 billionaires with a wealth of more than $100 billion each. This includes Elon Musk, the world's richest man and top Trump supporter, whose wealth has soared to over $300 billion. I think it has increased by $50 billion since the election last week. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, $224 billion. Larry Ellison of Oracle, $230 billion. Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, Facebook, $203 billion. And Warren Buffett, $145 billion. There are some slides here which show the extreme growth of social inequality. If you could show those over the past 2 decades, 25 years. This is a graph showing the labor share of national income from 2000 to 2024, which has shown a precipitous decline, including particularly under the Democratic Party administrations, but this has been a bipartisan policy. It has a real collapse. That is the share of the national income going to labor, to the working class. The next slide. This is a graph showing the rise in income inequality, one of the basic measures of income inequality, the Gini coefficient, which again shows the continuous growth of social inequality over decades. This graph shows the growth from 1970 through the present. The extreme growth of social inequality, which of course is reflected in the immense concentration of wealth in the hands of the capitalist oligarchy. And finally, the next slide. This just shows the rise in the wealth of the oligarchy, primarily in the United States, which increased 62% under the Biden administration from 2021 through 2024. The individual billionaires are listed, most of them in the United States, showing a staggering growth in the wealth of this tiny layer of the population. The blue is the net worth in January of 2021, and the corresponding net worth as of November of 2024. And that actually does not include the growth in wealth since the election. I mentioned already that Elon Musk's wealth personally has grown now to over $300 billion. Now, Trump in this context is not merely an individual with authoritarian inclinations. He is the political representative of an entrenched capitalist oligarchy. This oligarchy is breaking with democratic forms of rule. The administration, as will be detailed by Tom, is prepared to use every mechanism of the state to deport millions of immigrants, suppress dissent, and attack what Trump has repeatedly referred to as the enemy within. At the forefront of Trump and the Republican Party's social policies is a brutal assault on the living standards of the working class. Musk, whose wealth, as I indicated, has skyrocketed, has stated that the policies of the incoming administration will produce hardship, which means a massive attack on essential social programs and an increase in exploitation. He has called for a cut in government spending by $2 trillion, which can be only taken out of Social Security, Medicare, and other basic social programs. It is worth stressing that while Harris had the backing of many billionaires, in advance of the election, several of the wealthiest oligarchs made clear that they were either openly backing a Trump victory or else were orienting themselves to such an outcome. Perhaps most significant is the response of Bezos, the world's second wealthiest individual, who instructed the Washington Post not to endorse a candidate, and in the aftermath of Trump's victory, congratulated him for his, quote, extraordinary political comeback and decisive victory, and wished him every success. In terms of the objective conditions underlying the turn of the ruling class to dictatorship, one should also stress the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has ravaged and continues to ravage American society, with nearly 1.5 million lives lost to date and countless more millions impacted by long COVID. There's a couple slides on the pandemic, if you could show those. This would be the next slide. I'm sorry, they must not be there. The impact of the pandemic has been colossal in the United States and all over the world, and continues. Over 1.5 million in the United States, according to the estimates. The excess death estimates conducted by The Economist were stopped earlier this year, but they show an ongoing catastrophe of mass death and long COVID, which has debilitated millions and millions of people and goes completely unmentioned in the political establishment. The World Socialist website and the Socialist Equality Party have referred to the normalization of mass death and debilitation. We should recall that 4 years ago, Trump's coup was driven centrally by demands to remove all restraints on the spread of the coronavirus, regardless of the human cost. And that is a policy that the Biden administration has in fact implemented. The Trump victory must also be seen against the backdrop of the escalating war. Just as the pandemic has normalized mass death, the past year has seen the normalization of genocide and the massacre of Palestinians by Israel, backed by the United States and both of its parties. In Ukraine, NATO's proxy war against Russia has normalized nuclear war. This conflict, along with the war in Gaza, the genocide, is backed by the imperialist alliances, with openly fascist elements in both Israel and Ukraine. And the ruling class is preparing for the big one, that is the coming conflict with China. In several of the meetings prior to the election, we've referred to the recent article in Foreign Affairs, The Return of Total War by Mara Karlin, which makes the following assessment of the state of the escalating global war. She writes, in both Ukraine and the Middle East, what has become clear is that the relatively narrow scope that defined war during the post 9/11 era has dramatically widened. An era of limited war has ended. An age of comprehensive conflict has begun. Indeed, what the world is witnessing today is akin to what theorists in the past have called total war, in which combatants draw on vast resources, mobilize their societies, prioritize warfare over all other state activities, attack a broad variety of targets, and reshape their economies and those of other countries. What does it mean to mobilize all of society for war, to prioritize war over all other state activities? It means that everything must be subordinated to war. Social spending must be slashed to pay for war. The working class must be disciplined behind war. The class struggle must be suppressed in the interests of war. Opposition to war must be crushed and criminalized. The domestic corollary to total war is political dictatorship. Second, and in this context, the election and its aftermath have revealed not only the political bankruptcy, but the complicity of the Democratic Party in the turn of the ruling class to dictatorship and fascism. Eric London will review the figures in greater detail, but the election has clearly demonstrated that Trump was able to capitalize on broad-based social anger because there is no genuine articulation of the interests of the working class, the vast majority of the population within the political establishment. Indeed, Harris underperformed significantly compared to Biden in 2020, with support for the Democratic Party collapsing across nearly every demographic, aside from the affluent, middle class, and rich. There are not, as David stressed, tens of millions of people who want a dictatorship. And indeed, the actual program of the incoming Trump administration is deeply unpopular. But Trump was able to posture as the candidate of opposition to the social catastrophe that has developed under the Democrats and Biden. The Democrats are not the party of social anger, but of complacency, and as adopted by the Harris campaign in her campaign slogan, of joy. And the Democrats are a party of war and genocide. The central focus of the Biden administration over the past 4 years has been the escalation of war, the ongoing US-NATO war against Russia, and the genocide in Gaza in particular, which are two component parts of an expanding global war. Indeed, the Democrats' focus on war created the conditions in which Trump could absurdly present himself as an anti-war candidate. Even in the aftermath of the election, the Biden administration is escalating the war against Russia, which has already cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Last week, the Pentagon announced that US military contractors would now be deployed directly in Ukraine. The genocide in Gaza is a defining political experience for an entire generation. With military, political, and ideological support from the Biden administration and the entire political establishment, Israel has waged a year-long campaign of mass extermination and annihilation. The official death toll is over 43,600, while we know that the real death toll is far higher, 200,000 or more. If you could put up this slide. This is a graph showing the verified fatalities, deaths in Gaza since October 7th, 2023, the beginning of the genocide, by age group, which shows, in fact, the majority of those killed in this onslaught are among the youngest. 0 to 4 is at the bottom. It shows percentage of victims, male on the left and female on the right, about half and half. and by age, 0 to 4 at the bottom. The largest group, cohort of those killed in the genocide is aged 5 to 9. An absolute slaughter, which is ongoing. The Democratic Party was and remains committed to a massive escalation of the war. During her campaign, Harris repeatedly pledged to ensure that the U.S. military is the, as she put it, strongest and most lethal in the world. In the final weeks before the election, she campaigned with arch warmonger Liz Cheney, touting the support for the Democratic Party from leading Republicans associated with the war against Iraq and the institution of torture as state policy. This was combined with the relentless promotion of racial and identity politics. The Democrats could not and were opposed to making any appeal based on the interests of the working class, instead haranguing voters for not turning out for Harris, allegedly due to racism and hatred of women. Now, the lesser of two evils argument was and is bankrupt in two respects. First, the Democrats themselves are responsible for genocide in Gaza and the expansion of war, as well as culpability in the attack on democratic rights, including the arrests and suppression of protests against the genocide on campuses throughout the country. And second, it is impossible to oppose Trump and the Republicans through support for the Democratic Party. Indeed, the response of the Democrats to the election marks a continuation of their response to the coup 4 years ago. Then, amidst the ongoing coup, Biden went on national television to appeal to Trump to call it off while the Democrats did nothing to stop it themselves. This was followed, David referenced, by the call for a strong Republican Party raised by Biden, Pelosi, and other Democrats. Now, in response to Trump's victory, the Democrats are not seeking to alert the population of what is to come, let alone mobilize opposition to take measures to block Trump's plans. Instead, the Democrats are treating the elections as if it was just another normal process of the transfer of power. As David mentioned, gone are the Democrats' occasional references to Trump as a fascist. Harris only recently warned that Trump represented a grave threat to democratic rights, warmly congratulated him on his victory. Biden went on national television to declare that he would direct my entire administration to work with his team to ensure a peaceful and orderly transition. And then there is the interview which appeared in the New York Times this morning with Nancy Pelosi, in which she declares that the Democratic Party is in fact still the party of the working class, an absurd declaration. But this is what she says about the incoming Trump administration. And the question, are you going to try to work with the Republicans? She replies, it's not a question of that. We always try to work with Republicans. That's a responsibility that we have. It used to be that way until recent times. We always tried to find our common ground. And then in relationship to Trump, she says, he's the president. We all want the president to succeed. We wanted him to succeed in 2016 until they went down a path that we had to disagree with. By the way, the path which they disagreed with was on the question of the escalation of the war against Russia. That was their main foundation of their conflict with Trump. But she continues, but again, let's give this a chance and see where we can find our common ground. That is the response of the Democratic Party to the elections. And of course, this is in line with the class character of the Democrats, a party of Wall Street, the military intelligence agencies, and privileged sections of the upper middle class. Its main enemy is not on the right, but on the left. The fourth point I want to stress is in relationship to the broader social and ideological issues. In advance of the elections, the World Socialist website published a very important reply from David North to a letter from historians backing Harris. The letter completely covered up the actual policies of the Biden-Harris administration, including not even referencing the genocide in Gaza, while absurdly asserting that Harris had dedicated her life to affirming the rule of law and democracy. Moreover, the academics completely ignored the underlying factors necessary for any serious explanation of the rise of Trump. As David noted in reply, without an analysis of the causes of the emergence of a significant fascist threat in the United States, there can be no serious and successful struggle against it. In a subsequent letter following up on the reply to the historians, we pointed to the theoretical framework of Democratic Party politics over an extended period of time, based on the elevation of race and gender as the central political categories, and the rejection of any appeal to the working class. The Democrats' debacle exposes the reactionary character of what David referred in that letter as the flim-flam of identity politics. He wrote, "In the United States, the new anti-Marxism blended with the long-standing tradition of anti-communism. Left-wing politics of the sort connected to working-class militancy disappeared. The grievances related to identity displaced any serious concern with the massive concentration of wealth in a small segment of society at the expense of the working class. The pseudo-left replaced calls for equality with demands for equity. This was closely connected to the relentless harping on racial and ethnic differences, and with it, a contempt for the genuinely democratic traditions of the United States. This found noxious expression in the 1619 Project. All this has been accompanied by a general cultural degradation, the promotion of every form of backwardness." It is worth pointing to the response of Nicole Hannah-Jones, the lead architect of the 1619 Project, to the election, which of course is to blame racism and hatred of women. She writes, "Anti-Blackness continues to be a powerful force in this country." She added, quote, "We are already seeing the rationalizing of how we got here, and the blaming of the political party, that is the Democratic Party, that though flawed actually reflects multiracial democracy. We must resist this. Voters knew exactly who Trump was and chose him anyway." That is, it is not the Democratic Party that is responsible, but anti-Black racism. In fact, the pseudo-left's obsession with identity has created fertile ground for the rise of Trump and the effort to build up a genuine fascist movement, including through the promotion of the most vile forms of racism. By dividing the working class along racial lines, the Democratic Party has played a critical role in facilitating the rise of the far right. Fifth, and finally, the coming to power of a second Trump administration will intensify the social and political crises of the American ruling class. The prevailing sentiment in the American working class is not one of demoralization and defeat, but rather of profound social anger. This anger, however, lacks a clear political direction, and the confusion generated by years of reactionary Democratic Party politics has allowed Trump to exploit these frustrations. But there are clear signs of a developing rebellion, which Jerry will review in more detail. Over the past year, the anger of workers and youth has expressed itself in the protests of millions all over the world against the genocide in Gaza. And we have seen a series of strikes in the United States in critical industries, including among auto workers, aerospace workers at Boeing, dock workers, and other critical sections of the working class, with workers striving to break free from the control of the corporatist trade union apparatus. In our own campaign, the Socialist Equality Party advanced a real program upon which the working class could fight. In announcing the campaign in February, we explained that its purpose, quote, is to raise the political consciousness of the working class, to develop its understanding that no solution can be found to any of the problems confronting working people except through the ending of the capitalist system and its replacement with socialism, and that this great historic task can only be achieved by adopting a global strategy aimed at the mobilization of the power of the American and international working class in a unified struggle against the world capitalist system. Under conditions of a universal media blackout of the SEP campaign and the massive and undemocratic restrictions on all independent and third-party candidates, our campaign won a significant vote where we are on the ballot. But we stressed throughout the campaign that it was about far more than an attempt to win votes. It was an effort and is an effort to lay the foundations for a socialist movement among workers and youth, based on a clear understanding of the political tasks ahead. And this is now the central issue. The response to the election of Trump must be the fight to go deeper into the working class, to develop within the working class a political and socialist leadership. We recognize the dangers posed by a new Trump administration, but as David stressed, now is not the time for panic. It is the time to organize, strategize, and the basis of this organizing and strategizing must be the fight for genuine socialism, for Trotskyism, for the building of a socialist leadership in the working class in the US and internationally. And finally, I urge all of you watching this meeting today, as you are listening to the very important reports that are being delivered, to draw the necessary conclusion. Fill out the form to join the Socialist Equality Party, to get involved in this fight. This is the most fundamental and necessary response to the re-election of Donald Trump.
First, I have to just remind my co-speakers and comrades, we have very sensitive microphones, so what everyone was hearing at times was shuffling of papers. I'm sure all our listeners understand that. I just want to make a point here. I think everyone listening to Joe's speech, that we place a tremendous amount of emphasis, or central emphasis, on the political education of the working class, of the youth, of all those who are serious in their commitment to the defense of democracy, their opposition to war, and the fight for socialism. A socialist movement is not built by dumbing down, by the use of facile slogans. It builds on the basis of analysis, of an understanding of the lawful development of society, an understanding of the historical experiences of the last century and their importance for the developments which are taking place today. We've said this many times. We are living in a world whose problems would be very much recognized by the great revolutionary figures of the past. The history of man is the history of class struggle, wrote Marx and Engels. Never was that historical analysis so clearly vindicated as in the conditions of our own time. I just want to add again before we go to the next speaker, we are engaged in a daily process of political analysis. The World Socialist website, our principal organ of political analysis, is produced each day. Each day there is a perspective which explains the major events of the day and provides a path forward. It is subject to continuous censorship. We appeal to all of you who are watching, of course, to read the website every day and to make sure that you distribute among your friends, your co-workers, fellow students, those articles which you find particularly important. They need to be shared, they need to be distributed so that they get the widest possible circulation. The next speaker will be Eric Lunder, a member of the National Committee of the Socialist Equality Party and writer for the World Socialist website. He is going to analyze the election vote, what it revealed, about what were the underlying forces and factors at work in the election of Trump. So I'll turn this now over to Eric. Go ahead.
Thank you, Comrade Dave, and Comrade Joe for those remarks as well. If we could go to the slides, please. Okay, I'm going to try and jump right into it by breaking down what, through a combination of reviewing the election data and the exit poll data, what we can tell about what the election results tells us about the political situation here in the United States. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. Thanks. So this is the results. These are now the final results. At least the Electoral College votes are have all been tallied. Results are still coming in from the West Coast, but Trump has beaten Harris by 312 to 226 electoral votes. It is essentially the reverse of the 2020 outcome, just in terms of the Electoral College. Trump has won over 50% of the popular vote, some 70, will end up being about 74 million votes. And Harris has won just under 48% of the vote. That will end up being closer to 71 million. And the map here shows that every single battleground state that was up for grabs in this election was won by Trump, including all three of the industrial Midwestern, quote unquote, battleground state, blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. It's worth just looking at these numbers. We now have 3 elections in which Trump has been the Republican candidate. Starting at the top here, looking at the popular vote, perhaps the single most important statistic from this election is that the Democratic Party lost about 10 million votes from the last election to this election. It was running the incumbent vice president who had ran on the last ticket that received 81 million votes. And although Trump did not himself increase his vote total by a significant amount, he held steady, essentially increasing slightly from 74 and change to 75 million. And the Democrats declined from over 80 million to just about 71 million, a massive historic collapse in support. This was, if you look at the bottom chart, this was the first time that in these 3 elections that Trump has won a majority or plurality of the votes. Trump lost the popular vote to Clinton in 2016 and to Biden by a substantial margin in 2020. This time, it appears that he will have won by a substantial several million vote margin, the popular vote as well. And that's the first, that he has won, of course, more votes than any Republican candidate in the history of the country. Next slide, please. The Democratic Party, as comrades have already reported, ran a campaign based on a combination of right-wing economic policies, imperialism, and identity politics. And these statistics are critical because they expose the fact that identity politics is not winning substantial or really any support beyond the most affluent 10% of the population to which the Democratic Party's entire electoral strategy is pitched. In 2008, Black men voted for Obama by a 90 to 10 margin, an 80% margin of victory overall. The next few slides will show will be based on margin of victory. That has declined substantially now to only 56%. In a very brief period of time, that is a significant decline in support for the Democratic Party candidate. And you can see that since 2008, it has been a more or less a linear decline. And this is the period as well. And Obama's presidency was the culmination, if one wants to use that term, of the really vile right-wing politics based on personal, racial, gender identity. Next slide, please. You see a similar process on a somewhat different, perhaps even greater scale for Latino men. The Democratic Party has consistently beaten Republicans by a 30% margin for the last several cycles. That, in this most recent election, turned into a defeat. Trump defeated the Democrats by a margin of 12% among Latino men. Next slide, please. And these numbers are perhaps even more significant. The percentage of young people who supported the Democratic Party, this has always been for the Democrats, it's been a question more of turnout rather than knowing that they will win votes from this demographic. And yet in this election, in large part because so many young people who are opposed to the genocide in Gaza refused to vote for Harris due to her complicity and role in prolonging and escalating the genocide. The margin declined from 40% in 2008 to just 11% in this election. Next slide, please. These are two exit polls which show how the income breakdown has changed from 2020 to 2024. I want to remind people this is just 4 years. This is not a very long period of time, and substantial changes, therefore, should be really understood to be quite significant. If you look at the top chart, the Democratic Party has traditionally built its, at least since the New Deal, its electoral strategy on winning the votes of working class voters. In fact, the old saying was on election day that the country's Republican until 5 p.m. when the working class gets off work and starts voting. The Democrats defeated Trump in 2020 by substantial margins among those making less than $100,000, and they lost among those making more than $100,000. In other words, Trump, if one wants to speak generally, was winning more votes from rich people, and Biden was winning more votes from the working class. That is reversed in 2024. If you look to the bottom half of this slide, Harris won among the poorest section of the population only very narrowly, 50 to 46. Trump defeated Harris by 53 to 45% among those making $30,000 to $50,000, 51 to 46% among those making $50,000 to $100,000. But here is where it is most significant. Among the affluent, the Democratic Party, this is the only demographic of all ages, races, whatever one wants to look at, the only demographic where the Democratic Party increased their vote support was among the affluent and among the super rich. They were able to win, and I think that this is for the first time in any federal election for which exit poll data is available. The Harris won 51 to 47 among those making $100,000 to $200,000, and was also defeated Trump among those making $200,000 or more. We'll have more to say about this, but next slide, please. The next slide is a way of looking at this in a slightly different way. And if you see here, again, just as we said, the Democratic Party saw a massive collapse in support among the working class in this election. It was less that Trump was able to increase his support because, again, we know that his vote totals stayed relatively the same from 2020. But it is here that one really sees that the Democratic Party, of course, 90% of the population more or less fits into those three categories on the left. And you can't win an election in a country of 350 million people if you suffer this type of an electoral debacle among masses of working people. Next slide, please. Now, there's multiple elements to these two exit polls, but I want to start by looking at the percentage of people. Don't look yet at the red and blue numbers. Look at the number of people who said in 2020 that the coronavirus has caused them severe hardship. 16%, 39% said moderate financial hardship, 44% said no financial hardship at all. So still over half the population said that there was some financial hardship caused by the pandemic. Fast forward to 2024 and look at those same numbers on the bottom half. 75% of the population is experiencing hardship, a massive increase in just 4 years. 22%, up from 16%, say that hardship is severe, and 53%, up from 39%, say the hardship is moderate. Only a quarter of the population says they are suffering from no hardship, and Harris did very well among these voters. Among voters who have nothing really to worry about financially, who do not worry about making ends meet, who aren't worried about where their next paycheck is going to come from or how they can afford groceries or gas, Harris, of course, did very well. They were running a campaign on Keep America Great, a campaign of maintaining joyfulness. Of course, this had the result of angering a vast majority of the population who is suffering financially. Next slide, please. And this is a similar slide, which shows, again, if one takes just looking at the percentage of the population which thinks the country's on the right and the wrong track, it was 62%, 33% wrong track versus right track in 2016. And now, it is only 6% of the country is enthusiastic about conditions in the United States. 19% are, I guess, they're satisfied. That's somewhat of an ambiguous term. But 75% of the country is either angry or dissatisfied. And again, Harris performs very well among that tiny sliver of the population that is enthusiastic, whose stock portfolios have been increasing over the last 4 years, who aren't concerned with the genocide, who aren't concerned or aware of, or maybe making money off of the escalation of the war against Russia. Next slide, please. And now I want to turn to some of the regions which have some regional points, because this was basically a universal shift towards Trump from the last election. And these are historic changes. This is the point we're stressing. It really can't be said anymore that the Democratic Party is the party of the working class. The Republican Party, of course, is not either, and Trump and his allies attempt to present otherwise. But all those like Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez who run around the country trying to convince people, to audiences, smaller and smaller audiences, that the Democratic Party can be pushed to the left, pushed to adopt progressive policies, that is falling on deaf ears among masses of working people. Fall River, Massachusetts, one of the oldest industrial city areas in the country, old textile hub, has voted for the Democratic presidential candidate in every election since 1924. Obama won it by 50%. Hillary Clinton won it by 22%. Trump won it for the first time in 2024. Go down to Hidalgo County, Texas, which is in the Rio Grande Valley. Voted for the Democratic presidential candidate for generations. It even voted for Clinton by a massive margin. Biden's margin was about half that in 2020, but Trump flipped it and won by 16% in 2024. There has been much comment on Dearborn, Michigan, which has voted for the Democratic Party for generations, voted for Biden by an 88% margin, and Trump won Dearborn by 6% in the most recent election as a result of massive opposition among Arab American and young voters over the Biden-Harris administration's role in the genocide. A couple more quick examples just to show that this is not just in the Northeast or in the South or in one or another area. San Joaquin County, California, Central Valley, working class town, working class county, home to Stockton, California, voted for Obama by 10%, Clinton by 13%, Biden by 14%, Trump won it by 2%. Mahoning County in Ohio, East Ohio, which is where Youngstown, the old steel center, is, voted for the Democrats in every election since 1972. Trump did win it in 2020 by a hair, but he increased his margin and won it by 11% in 2024. Next slide, please. Again, this is not because there is Trump won 75 million votes, but he did not increase his votes by a massive amount. It was largely Democratic Party voters who stayed home or voted for Trump, who had voted for the Democrats in 2020. Take a look at some of these. I'm not going to go through each and every one of this. And these numbers may change slightly. There's still some votes outstanding in some of these cities, but 400,000 people in Chicago who voted for the Democratic Party in 2020 did not do so in 2024. That's a 40% decline. Almost 1 out of every 2 Cook County voters who voted for Biden did not vote for Harris. Detroit, there was a decline of 65,000. Philadelphia, 50,000. Boston, 22% decline, 60,000. And again, this is taking place in all different regions. Houston, there was an 115,000 vote decline. Similar in smaller Jackson, Mississippi, largely black city, 75,000 people voted for Biden in 2020, 55,000 in 2024. And even in New York City, in every borough, the Democratic Party suffered a debacle. They lost 100,000 votes or more in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Queens, declines of between 20% and 30%. In other words, 1 in 5 people, 1 in 3 people who voted for the Democrats in 2020 did not do so in 2024. Next slide, please. And this is just another example. In California, the Democrats' margin has shrunk in every election. You see here on the right a list of the counties where the vote shifted to the right, and it includes a lot of these working class Central Valley counties, Fresno, San Joaquin, and others in there as well. Next slide, please. None of this means that this is a very right-wing electorate, and that's critical to point out. In fact, when asked what they think about policies, the overwhelming majority of Americans say that they support expanding Medicare, they support cutting the cost of prescription drugs, they want to make corporations and the wealthy pay higher taxes, and you're talking about 85% margins on some of these, expanding Social Security, rent increase cap. Next slide, please. Building mass numbers of affordable housing, raising the minimum wage. I mean, on each and every, eliminating all medical debt, 65% of the country supports that. I mean, could you imagine that? That is something that would never even be discussed in bourgeois politics. The point here, and this will get to the next set of slides, which I'll show, this is an oligarchic system in which the 90% of the population have absolutely no say in having any of the policies which they largely support be enforced by either party. Next slide, please. And now I want to show some of the material about the way in which because I think one point which the World Socialist website has made very forcefully is that the election outcome and the coming to power of Donald Trump, it represents a sort of coming into being or an expression of the real forms of social relations in America, which is that this is a society which is dominated by the new oligarchy, by a tiny sliver of the population, which controls almost all of the wealth. And next slide, please. Some of these will show how this happens. This is according to a study which was recently published by Americans for Tax Fairness, which shows that just 150 billionaire families spent $2 billion on the 2024 election. $1 billion. Doubling almost the number that those same families spent on the 2020 campaign. A massive increase in influence. Next slide, please. These are some of the top donors. You know, it's a lot of money for Republicans, but the Democrats are well represented as well. Timothy Mellon, the old Mellon family, donated $200 million. I mean, you go down the list here and you can see these are the people who make the decisions about policy in the United States. Next slide, please. Just a few more of these. This is another chart that shows some of these families. The Adelson family, Musk in the 130 millions. The Singers, the Bloombergs gave $45 million to the Democratic Party. But this is an oligarchic system of government. Next slide, please. You can actually you can skip this one just for time reasons. I'm going to ask you to skip that one. I want to read a couple of the quotes from this book. This is an important book published in 2021 by an Oxford University professor, Joe Foweraker. And he makes a couple of points about the way that American oligarchy today is different than the system of blatant corruption which existed in the Gilded Age of the 1890s, for example. He makes a couple of very important points. He says that the modern robber barons are successful in converting their market power into the political power to pursue policies that either distort markets or prevent government from reforming markets. The new barons do not, therefore, need public subsidies or favorable loans. They simply require a compliant federal government that allows them to impose their lucrative tolls on society. Next slide. He continues. He says, the rise of the financial oligarchy saw the balance of power shift decisively away from the elected constitutional government toward the unelected and largely unaccountable oligarchy. This was not the result of bribes or kickbacks or blood ties to important politicians, the usual sources of power in emerging markets plagued by crony capitalism, nor to special access to government funding or contracts, but, and this is a critical point, to a highly favorable tax regime and to permissive regulatory regime engineered to suit oligarchic interests. Next slide. And the last quote I'll read from this important book makes the point that the American government cannot be considered a democracy. It's what he calls a patrimonial state, a state which is inherited from one generation of oligarchs to the next. He says the role of the patrimonial state in guaranteeing the conditions of oligarchic rule is routinely projected and reproduced through a political class of this kind that comfortably adapts to different institutional templates within democracy, frequently finds expression in political families, clans, or tribes, and typically survives generational change. It is alleged that just such a self-perpetuating and self-aggrandizing political class, in other words, the two-party system, exists in America with its apex in Congress and the higher echelons of the federal administration. Thus, virtually all senators and most of the representatives in the House are members of the top 1%, are sustained and rewarded by the top 1%, as are the key executive branch policy members on trade and economic policy. Next slide, please. And before I conclude, just a couple points here. This chart shows on the left the increase, though it only ends at 2015, in the total net worth of the two houses of Congress combined, just doubled in the last 10 years. The chart to the right shows the wealth of some of the richest members of Congress. You can see some in the many hundreds of millions. Next slide, please. And donation, this will come as a surprise to nobody, but donations have continued to increase over the years and likely increased massively in the last election as well. Next slide, as we already discussed, actually, they have. Next slide. I just want to make one can speak of the Supreme Court, the fact that 5 of its members were appointed by presidents who lost the popular vote, the fact that many of them have been embroiled in the most naked and putrid corruption scandals that the Supreme Court has ever seen. But this is a chart which shows that although the Democrats and Republicans in the outgoing Senate control 50 seats each, that the Democrats won 20 million votes more to get those 50 seats than Trump did if one looks at the 2018, 2020, and 2022 senatorial cycles. That's about 500,000 votes more per seat the Democrats have to win than Republicans. And in the 2016 cycle, this is perhaps most glaring, and calling for the abolition of the Senate under these conditions is reasonable because in that cycle, the Democrats won 51 million votes. They won only 12 seats. The Republicans won 10 million votes less, but they won 10 more seats. I mean, this is American democracy. And the last slide is, if you'll go one more, please, just that the amount of money poured into a tiny sliver of congressional seats, which will change the balance of power, is just 43 of the 435 seats in the House this year were competitive. And then if one looks at these absurd geographical discrepancies, why does Wyoming have 2 Senate seats? Why does each of the Dakotas have 2 Senate seats? Under these conditions, the weight of reaction drags the entire system to the right. Wyoming, your vote for Senate counts 68 times more than it does if you live in Los Angeles or another part of California. So if I could make a couple points in conclusion, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez recently went on social media and gave a speech in which she said, I'll just quote from her briefly, as a result of the impact of the election, this is the main point she wanted to make. We have to be able to construct a culture that is productive, that is focused on growing, that is not sectarianism, that does not tear one another apart over what she calls the narcissism of small differences. Well, Congresswoman, The genocide in Gaza is not a small difference. The illegalizing of strikes is not a small difference. The escalation of a war against Russia, a war that you voted for to give tens of billions of dollars, take them away from working people who need them, on a war that risks nuclear catastrophe, that is not a small difference. The Biden administration's asylum ban is not a small difference. And as for the attack on sectarianism, all they mean by that is that we oppose the Democratic Party, that the Socialist Equality Party and the World Socialist website are fighting to break people from the Democrats and the trade union bureaucracies, and to build a mass movement in the working class that's capable of fighting for the expropriation of the wealth of the rich, for the placing the banks and corporations under public social ownership to direct social need to meet human need, to direct social production to meet human need and not private profit. That's the policies which we're fighting for in the working class. And if that is not sectarianism, but it goes to show that the DSA, Sanders, Ocasio-Cortez, what they are primarily concerned of is a real revolutionary movement on the left. And that's what we're fighting to build. And we ask all of you watching this to join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. I think your report exemplifies the well-known adage that facts are hard things. We would challenge the Democratic Party and its apologists to provide their analysis of what these votes mean, how they have managed to forfeit the votes of millions and millions of working Americans who are suffering under the present system, how they could claim continuously that this is the best of all possible worlds, when in fact, facts, statistics show precisely the opposite. There are conclusions to be drawn from this. I just want to make one more point. It was Bernie Sanders who just a week before the election said that Biden is the most progressive president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I mean, anyone who even knows anything about bourgeois politics would recognize the absurdity of such a statement. Roosevelt was the representative of the New Deal, which brought in, if nothing else, Social Security. Kennedy and Johnson's administrations were associated with the preparation and implementation of what was then known as the Great Society, which witnessed the last period of social reform in the United States more than a half century ago. What did Biden accomplish? Nothing of the sort. In fact, the statistics presented by Eric document the escalation, massive ongoing transfer of wealth to the rich. It would be worthwhile to draw or present graphs which show the relationship between the massive bailouts, which began in 2008, and which in the space of the last 16 years have quadrupled the national debt from somewhere in the area of 8 trillion to 35 trillion, and the exponential growth in the wealth of the ruling class. These facts and these statistics provide a rational explanation to what the Democratic Party tries to suggest is an irrational outcome, that somehow the people just made a mistake. They didn't appreciate all the wonders of their rule. And of course, people like Ocasio-Cortez exemplify that. They call our criticism bad faith criticism. Well, our criticism corresponds to facts. Before we go to the next speaker, I do want to state that the work which we have ahead of us will require an enormous development of the efforts of the World Socialist website, the expansion of its circulation, our more effective use of social media to establish an effective interrelationship between social media and the WSWS. All of this requires resources, and so I'd like to make a very strong appeal to you to make a donation today to the World Socialist website. Go to wsws.org/donate. We really do need these funds. money is obviously a critical resource that we need in order to develop our work. Again, wsws.org/donate. The next speaker is going to be Comrade Tom Carter. Tom has written extensively on matters relating to democratic rights, also on questions of identity politics, which he has worked very effectively to expose. Tom is going to discuss the implications of the Trump administration for democratic rights. Tom.
Good evening, good morning, depending on where you're listening in the world. I understand we have a large audience on various channels. I'll be making some warnings about what Trump and his allies actually plan to do. This will be a shorter report, and there are some slides so you can follow along. Now, I want to begin by pointing to what Biden said on Thursday in his concession speech. He said, referring to Trump becoming president, quote, "We're going to be okay. We're going to be okay," he said. His statement, of course, recalls Obama's comment after the 2016 elections that those elections were an intramural scrimmage, emphasizing that he and Trump were on the same team before handing him the reins. Biden and Harris have also made numerous references to a, quote, "peaceful transfer of power." By this, they only mean that Biden and the Democrats don't want the streets to be full of crowds of people opposed to Trump. And by saying we're going to be okay and similar things, they're trying to cover up the extent of the danger, trying to anesthetize the population for the pain that's coming. So it's necessary in response to Biden's lullaby to make some real warnings about what's coming. Not, as David North said, from the standpoint of despair or panic, but from the standpoint of being informed so we can act intelligently. Everything I'm about to say is drawn from statements from Trump and his camp, but these are certainly not absolute predictions. We're warning about the dangers. First, Trump is planning a massive deportation operation to deport millions of people. The Center for American Progress puts the number of undocumented people in the U.S. at around 11.3 million, with 7 million of them working. A deportation operation of 11.3 million people would require the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of police and soldiers, together with the construction of internment camps. Now, Trump himself, in support of this operation, has cited the same law that was used to justify the internment of Japanese Americans during the Second World War, the Alien Enemies Act. Now, contrary to Trump's racist lies, the undocumented immigrant population actually contributes to the economy more than it takes out, because these workers are highly exploited. Mass deportation would, in fact, disrupt commerce on a huge scale and actually cause the GDP to shrink, in fact. In addition, how will they locate all these people? Will they lock down cities and search house to house? Will it become a crime to shelter or hide an undocumented person? Will they fly heat imaging drones over people's houses? Just to give an example of the many issues posed by this operation, the U.S. has birthright citizenship thanks to the 14th Amendment, which was passed to give citizenships to former slaves after the Civil War. Under the 14th Amendment, all you have to do to prove you are a citizen of the U.S. currently is to show your birth certificate. If you're a naturalized citizen, you can show your naturalization papers. If you're a citizen, you show your birth certificate, because being born in the United States is all that's required to be a U.S. citizen. So what happens to the families of people where the parents are undocumented, but the children are citizens? What happens to those children? What happens to those children? Trump is threatening, and has threatened many times, to abrogate or overturn the 14th Amendment, and, as he puts it, end birthright citizenship. The implication evidently being that the children will be deported even if they are citizens. Now, you might say that's totally illegal. He can't do that. That's against the Constitution. But one has to remember he now controls the presidency and the Supreme Court, as well as the Senate and possibly even the House. Is the Supreme Court, stacked with his operatives, going to stop him? The Supreme Court has already granted him presumptive immunity as of July 1st of this year to act as a dictator without fear of criminal prosecution. Next, we've made the point before in defining fascism that it is not just the tropes and symbols or the extra-parliamentary violence. A specific characteristic of fascism is its anti-Marxist character. All of that violence and vitriol is directed specifically at the most class-conscious opposition always, and that means above all Marxists. Now, Trump has said, quote, this is a direct quote, "Using federal law, Section 212F of the Immigration and Nationality Act, I will order my government to deny entry to all communists and all Marxists. We don't want them if they want to destroy our country. So we are going to be keeping foreign, Christian-hating communists, socialists, and Marxists out of America. We're keeping them out of America," unquote. Now, does this mean that at the airport, immigration officials will now be asking if you are a Marxist or not? If the answer is yes, you'll presumably be put on a plane and sent home. Maybe they will search your phone, which they already have an unrestricted power to do, to see if you've been reading articles from the World Socialist website. But Trump went beyond this, adding that his campaign would also seek to expel or target Marxists who were born and raised in the United States. Quote, "Today I'm announcing a new plan to protect the integrity of our immigration system. Federal law prohibits the entry of communists and totalitarians into the U.S. But my question is, what are we going to do with the ones that are already here, that grew up here? I think we have to pass a new law for them." That statement speaks for itself. As violent as the rhetoric is coming from Trump, his surrogates are even more blood-curdling, calling for, quote, "rough Roman justice," unquote. Bannon has been screaming for the execution of every journalist who supposedly helped Biden steal the 2020 elections. And this is not just individual personalities. These people are about to assume state power, so their statements are not just rabid barking. It reflects what is about to be state policy. Now, there's been some discourse about how executive officials and military officials should insist that their loyalty is to the Constitution and not the president. But this is answered by Project 2025, a wish list for a massive restructuring of the federal government that was prepared by figures in Trump's first administration and others. But one of their aims is to, quote, "make federal bureaucrats more accountable to the democratically elected president and Congress." Now, Trump and his wing are saying, your loyalty is not, in fact, to the Constitution, but to Trump, because he won the popular vote and therefore supposedly represents the will of the people or the will of the nation. And that's just a translation into English of the leader principle, the Führer principle, quite consciously. And it's in its Supreme Court decision giving Trump immunity on July 1st, the Supreme Court likewise insisted that the president must be free to engage in, quote, "bold and unhesitating action." Dismantling public education will be a major priority of the Trump administration. When he says parental control, that means parents can block the teaching of evolution or sexual health at public schools. When he says school choice, this means diverting funds to private and religious schools. Trump has said that teachers will be required to, quote, "teach students to love their country, not to hate their country." And any teacher who resists this will be fired en masse. Trump has threatened to, quote, "fire the poor ones. They will be fired just like The Apprentice. You're fired," unquote. He has also promised to, quote, bring back prayer in schools. He even announced a plan to use students as interns, making schools into workhouses that provide unpaid or cheap labor for corporations in the name of giving students, quote unquote, job experience. The federal right to abortion has already been abolished. The Republicans have threatened to impose a national ban, banning it in the states where it's still allowed. In line with the states that already ban abortion, this also means targeting doctors and health professionals with criminal prosecutions or regulatory harassment. But there's nothing stopping them there. There's nothing in principle at this point preventing, at a local or national scale, banning or limiting contraception. The Supreme Court could reverse itself and abolish the right of same-sex couples to marry or revisit any other reform. In some states, it could even become illegal to marry or even to be gay at all. As far as Trump is concerned in his statements, specifically with regard to transgender people, it's not about discriminating against transgender people or taking away their rights or depriving them of medical care. As far as the Trump camp is concerned, transgender people have no right to exist at all. And this is a population that, by all accounts, is between 1 and 2 million people in the United States. Dismantling education, dismantling democratic rights. Then there is dismantling public health. Trump has indicated he will give a public health role to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And this is like putting Blackbeard in charge of maritime commerce. One of his first acts, he said, would be to attack fluoridation of water. If anyone has seen Dr. Strangelove, this is an old anti-communist trope from the McCarthy period that supposedly fluoridation of water is an international Marxist conspiracy to pollute our precious bodily fluids. This is a signal that whatever remains of public health after a half decade of the COVID pandemic will be effectively dismantled. These are just some examples, specific measures proposed by the Trump wing, but the Trump wing imagines not just these specific measures, but a dismantling entirely of the framework of federal regulation over the economic system built up over the last century, including specifically following the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression. These reforms were designed in one way or another to mitigate the more extreme excesses that would otherwise be caused by the anarchy of the capitalist market. So while attention has been focused on the Supreme Court's decision July 1st on presidential immunity, on June 28th, the justices decided another extremely important case, overturning what had been called the Chevron doctrine. This effectively gutted the power of federal regulatory agencies to do their jobs. Protections for the environment will be eliminated. Drill, baby, drill, Trump says. Regulation across the board will be gutted, from workplace safety to healthcare costs. Trump has cultivated support specifically among law enforcement officers. He called during his campaign for giving the police, quote, 1 rough hour to supposedly eliminate crime. But it's not just going to be open season for police brutality. Aping his fascist heroes from the last century, Trump has also sought as best he can at every turn to cultivate and encourage right-wing vigilantes, Kyle Rittenhouse being a famous example. Rittenhouse is a white supremacist Proud Boy who killed 2 people and injured a third during a protest against police brutality in 2020. He's still around on Twitter, cheerleading for the Trump campaign and boasting about how he's armed to the teeth. Trump has also said that he would use the U.S. military, not just police and vigilantes, but the military itself, to quote unquote go after Americans who disagree with them, whom he's called, quote, the enemy from within. The direct use of the military against the population already happened during the Trump administration. You'll remember the time he carried a Bible out of his bunker during the George Floyd protests, using the military to clear the streets, shouting, quote, I am your president of law and order. That was just a dress rehearsal, establishing the principle that the military can now be used against the population. The incoming Republicans have also threatened to deport Gaza protesters from university campuses, not just arrest them or expel them from school, but to deport them from the country. One of the 20 promises in the preamble of the platform adopted at the Republican National Convention was to, quote, deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our college campuses safe and patriotic again, unquote. When we're talking about democratic rights in the U.S., we have to remember that the U.S. government is currently waging a genocide in Gaza. Trump has called for Netanyahu to, quote, finish the job. A government that's capable of committing genocide abroad is certainly capable of a great deal at home. And making an example of everyone protesting against the genocide will be an early priority for Trump. Now, these are warnings about what is possible, not absolute predictions. But contrary to what Biden says about we're going to be okay, it's clear that the Trump wing of the American ruling class is going to attempt an abrupt and sweeping counter-revolution across the board. In a fundamental sense, the US economic system is already a dictatorship of the oligarchs. What's happening is that the political system is being transformed to match the economic reality, to bring it into alignment with the real distribution of power in the society that already exists. This shift will have a tremendous effect on popular consciousness. It already is having that effect. The whole theory of anti-Marxist liberal reformism, after all, is that under capitalism, in the long run, the arc supposedly bends towards progress. There may be steps forward and steps back, little increments, but in the long run, capitalism is supposed to guarantee democracy, raise living standards, and trend towards prosperity and equality. Well, it's going to come as a shock when 100 years of these hard-won increments are going to be yanked out of people's hands overnight. But as Marxists, we're not obviously surprised in the fundamental sense. What would surprise us is if the ultimate result of the US elections was 4 years of peace, prosperity, democratic reforms, and progress towards equality. Trump can't help what he is, nor can Harris or the Democrats help what they are. We're dealing with a historical process that Marxism, above all, is uniquely able to predict, understand, and act upon. And in particular, as has been said in the earlier reports, Trump is a product of the domination of anti-Marxist politics over the working class over a long period, what we call the politics of the pseudo-left. There is, in fact, a massive constituency for left-wing and socialist politics in the working class, along with a deep commitment to democratic rights. There have been countless attempts by the leftward-moving workers and young people to make their influence felt over the situation. Countless strike votes, work stoppages, the 2020 George Floyd protests, Occupy Wall Street before that, student protests, the Ferguson protests, now the Gaza protests. Every time these struggles were betrayed by the Democratic Party and its pseudo-left allies in the middle-class protest milieu and in the trade union bureaucracies, Trump has been strengthened. In this symbiotic way, Trump feeds off every betrayal by the pseudo-left. Every time the aspirations of workers and young people are sold out, Trump raises an eyebrow and says, "See, I told you so." So there are those who might say, well, if things are so bad under Trump, why didn't you call for a vote for Harris? And there are those who now will say, we now have to set aside all of our differences and come together in some generalized resistance. In response to that, let me say this. We have never underestimated the danger posed by Trump. We recognized that mobilizing the working class for a fight against the tendency represented by Trump involves a head-on fight against the Democratic Party, the trade union bureaucracy, and the anti-Marxist pseudo-left philosophies of subjective identity that have helped to produce Trump in the first place by preventing the working class from stepping forward. We can't fight Trump with our hands tied behind our backs by false ideas and treacherous leaders. The efforts of the pseudo-left to explain the election in terms of race and gender are hopelessly bad. The implications of all these breakdowns, Black women here, Hispanic men there, the implications is that white men supposedly voted for their interests when they voted for Trump. It's offensive if you stop and think about it for a minute. We have to take this head on. The collapse of the Democratic vote expresses a massive disaffection from this kind of politics, which has been used for decades to pander to people as a substitute for meeting the actual needs of the working class more broadly. This disaffection is only reflected in a contingent way in the vote for Trump in the absence of a left-wing alternative. So there will be a big fight to defend democratic rights. What I've described is what Trump and the Republicans are fantasizing about, but they know they can't impose those policies in reality and expect the working class not to try to defend itself. The working class will try to fight back as best it can. The Democrats and the pseudo-left are writing off the working class as hopelessly racist and sexist. That's wrong. The working class is necessarily a progressive force. It can't help it any more than Trump can help being Trump. That is its role in the historical process by virtue of its collective social relation to production. The working class produces everything. It is exploited. It outnumbers the exploiters. It's a global force, and its interests are objectively aligned with democratic rights, equality, science, peace, progress, and socialism. The struggles on the horizon will be more intense than many of us have experienced in our lifetime so far, and the turn has to be to the working class, to Marxism, to building a Marxist leadership as the most effective and the only way to fight Trump and defend democratic rights.
Thank you, Tom, for that comprehensive report. The last remarks that Tom made brings to mind one of the seminal declarations of Marx, actually several years before he wrote the Communist Manifesto with Engels in 1847. 3 years before, he had written a preliminary study answering the pseudo-left middle-class politics of his day. That is, as Marx was striving to understand what the revolutionary force in society was, why the working class was a revolutionary force, he worked this out in a series of very profound critiques of middle-class politics. I just want to read this passage from the Holy Family, because the question which arises is, and which of course Tom was concentrating on at the end of his remarks, and which Comrade Jerry will develop as when he reviews the development of the class struggle, given all the warnings we're making, is there a force capable of overcoming these dangers, of resisting these attacks? Is there a force which has an interest in doing so? Now, writing at a time when there were still many dictatorships in the world, they were of a feudal character, anti-democratic character, Marx wrote the following. He said, and he referred to the working class as the proletariat. He said the following: "It follows that the proletariat can and must emancipate itself, but it cannot emancipate itself without abolishing the conditions of its own life. It cannot abolish the conditions of its own life without abolishing all the inhuman conditions of life of society today, which are summed up in its own situation. Not in vain does it go through the stern but steeling school of labor. It is not a question of what this or that proletarian, or even the whole proletariat at the moment, regards as its aim. It is a question of what the proletariat is and what, in accordance with this being, it will be historically compelled to do. Its aim and historical action is visibly and irrevocably foreshadowed in its own life situation as well as in the whole organization of bourgeois, that is capitalist, society today." These profound words, again, apply with enormous force. Of course, there's confusion among workers. How could there not be? They're lied to relentlessly. They're lied to by the media. They're lied to by the labor bureaucracy. They're lied to by the Democratic Party. They're lied to by the Bernie Sanders, the Ocasio-Cortezes, the DSAs, all the different institutions which exist for the explicit purpose of suppressing the development of class consciousness. They are relentlessly bombarded with anti-communist propaganda, the state religion of American capitalism. So it must overcome all these difficulties. The objective possibility for overcoming that lie in the contradictions of capitalism itself, in the reality of the class struggle. The subjective prerequisites for the effective direction of the objective struggles which must arise is the fight for political leadership by the socialist movement, by the Socialist Equality Party, and by our comrades who are active in socialist equality parties and affiliated organizations all over the world within the framework of the Fourth International. Now, our next speaker is going to address the fundamental question. I've spoken about it, and at the conclusion of his remarks, Tom has spoken about it, you might say, in a theoretical sense. But is this correct? Does the empirical data, do the conditions which we actually see and confront, validate the political orientation to the working class? Is this realistic? Is the working class a potentially revolutionary force in society? That's the question which has to be answered, and I think it is the most important political question. Because the greatest challenge we face, and I'm speaking as one who has spent many, many decades in the socialist movement, is not so much the power of the bourgeoisie itself, but the ideological pressure which is exerted, coming from the academics, from the middle class left, the falsifiers of Marxism, all those who set about to deny this fundamental historical and political premise or postulate, that of the revolutionary role of the working class, to claim that there are other alternatives, as we call it, the flim-flam of identity politics, the attribution of a progressive role to other social forces, but never to the working class. So, again, to give empirical, factual substance to these theoretical points, I'd like to ask Comrade Jerry White to present the next report. Jerry has been a member of the Socialist Equality Party, and before that, his predecessor, the Workers' League, for now, I believe, about 45 years, and was our vice presidential candidate. He has personally participated in many significant working class struggles. So he's well qualified to address these issues. Jerry.
Well, thank you very much, Comrade Dave. I think many of the speakers this afternoon have highlighted the analysis of the World Socialist website that the coming to power of a second Trump administration represents the violent realignment of the American political superstructure in line with the real social relations of the United States, above all, the vast economic and political power of the corporate financial oligarchy. But the social counter-revolution, the literal turning back of the historical clock for more than a century, is going to escalate the class conflict, which has steadily been growing over the last number of years, to unprecedented levels, as the naked class interests of the Trump presidency is revealed to millions and millions of workers, including those who voted for Trump. The exit polls, as Comrade Eric indicated, show there is no popular support for mass deportations, the suspension of civil liberties, let alone the destruction of basic necessities. But Trump was able to exploit the indifference of the Democratic Party to the economic distress of tens of millions of people, the endless promotion of identity politics, which presents race and gender above class, and the blood-soaked character of the Democrats' support for imperialist war. This gave Trump the opportunity to posture as a pro-worker and anti-war candidate. Now, what are the economic facts of life in the United States? If you'd go to the first slide, which was shown, the next slide, please. This was shown by Comrade Joe earlier on the share of national income that goes to labor. It is at present at the lowest level in American history. Labor's share fell from about 2/3 or 64% in the first quarter of 2001 to 55.8% in the first quarter of 2024, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, this redistribution of wealth upward from the working class to the oligarchy, this was not because it was all given to immigrant workers. That's nonsense. A massive Big lie. No, instead, it was hoarded by a corporate and financial oligarchy which controls the entire political system. Corporate profits in the US increased by 25% from 2020 to the second quarter of 2024. The combined wealth of the top 10 billionaires in the US increased by 88% since the beginning of the pandemic. In the first quarter of 2024, 2/3 of the total wealth of the United States was owned by the top 10%. In comparison, the lowest 50% of earners controlled only 2.5% of the nation's total wealth. The bottom half controls only 2.5% of society's wealth. Now, workers, of course, over this last period, particularly since the 2020, their living standards have been devastated by the highest levels of inflation in decade, fueled primarily by the massive bipartisan bailouts of Wall Street, the criminal response to COVID, which led to the deaths of some 1.4 million people in the United States, tens and tens of millions throughout the world, and the trillions that are squandered on the war budget. As one commentator said, quote, Americans are spending more money to maintain the same standard of living. These days, the average household spends nearly $11,500 more annually to maintain the same standards of living as they had in January 2021, before inflation creeped up to 40 years high. Now, this is a chart which just indicates some basic food commodities and the enormous increase in their costs through 2023. Of course, it's continued to go up further. But the consumer price index, food sub-index, rose by 25%. That's the worst since 1979, 1983, during what was known as the Great Inflation era. The average cost of white bread has increased 46% since 2020, ground beef by 46%, fruit by 26%, and milk by 21%. The median homes, or if you could go to the next slide, this will just show you the continuation of this. This is a food basket that you would get at Walmart, which demonstrates just between April 2022 and March 2024, the total price increased from $27.89 to $48.30. That's an increase of 75%. Now, this is in every other aspect of life. Median home sales have increased by 25% since 2020. For renters, it's even worse. Half of all renter households, 22 million people, were, quote, cost burdened. There are many spending far more than half of their household income on housing and utilities. This is a huge issue among the workers who went out on strike at Boeing over the impossibly high cost of living in Seattle for housing. This slide is a picture. Of course, I had the opportunity to go to many cities in the course of this election campaign, and the levels of homelessness are staggering. This is a camp of the so-called unhoused in Pittsburgh, right in front of the old Heinz factory, which has been turned into high-cost, high-rent lofts. And the situation is devastating across the country. As I said, in Seattle, we spoke to social workers in Western Michigan who said that the actual percentage of people who are homeless is underestimated because the census doesn't count those who are living in the woods or living in storage containers. Of course, the household debt has exploded. Credit card debt now is at a record $1.14 trillion as people are forced to put groceries and medical bills and other necessities on their credit cards. Now, if we could go to the next slide. Yes. Well, this is a slide we've often utilized to show how the increase in the wealth of the top 1% has steadily increased, particularly since the 1980s, since the Reagan administration, and how this directly corresponds to the artificial suppression of the class struggle by the trade union bureaucracy of the AFL-CIO. You can see the scissors expanding as the top 1% sees its ever greater concentration of wealth, and the suppression of of strikes. This shows in the 1970s and even up into the 1980s, there were hundreds of strikes of workers, and the betrayals of the AFL-CIO, their collusion with both Democrats and Republicans, virtually eliminated strikes, which have for so long had been a daily occurrence of American life. In the 1990s, they literally disappeared. But now I think if we could go to the next slide, you see that over the last several years, this has begun to reverse itself. The impact of the massive bailout in 2008, 2009, the devastating impact, of course, of inflation. But you see in particular, let's say in 2023, there were 458,000 workers involved in major work stoppages, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls strikes involving more than 1,000 workers. That was up 280% from the year before. There were 33 strikes involving auto workers, Hollywood writers and actors, nurses, and public school teachers. This year, in an election year where the union bureaucracy traditionally works feverishly to prevent strikes as they campaign for the Democratic Party, there have already been at least 24 major strikes involving 220,000 workers, including 33,000 workers at Boeing. If you go to the next slide, 47,000 workers who went on strike on the East and Gulf Coast ports, 17,000 AT&T workers in the South, 30,000 University of California academic workers. And one thing that has characterized these struggles again and again have been the rebellion of the working class against the pro-capitalist, pro-war union bureaucracies. We have seen repeated mass rejections of contracts brought back by the union bureaucracies, by the United Auto Workers. Dakota workers rejected 4 such contracts. The Eaton Aerospace workers in Jackson, Michigan rejected 3 such contracts. The Boeing workers rejected 2 major contracts brought back by the union bureaucracy, and the rail workers have also rejected a contract brought back by the union bureaucracy and essentially written by the Biden administration. Now, of course, Biden has presented himself as the most pro-labor president in American history. That doesn't mean he benefited, as all of these figures show, the rank and file workers in the unions. No, he has worked closely with the labor bureaucracy in outlawing the railroad workers' strike, and his labor secretary, his acting labor secretary, Julie Su, has intervened repeatedly to shut down the strike on the docks, the powerful strike, in less than 3 days, because it threatened to undermine the shipment of weapons to Israel and the shipment of weapons to Ukraine. She intervened to block and shut down finally the Boeing workers' strike. Again, another major aerospace company and defense contractor for the Pentagon. And Ms. Su has also had a notorious role in sanctioning the completely undemocratic vote in the United Auto Workers Union, where the union bureaucracy, challenged by Will Lehman, who ran as a avowed socialist fighting to abolish the union bureaucracy and transfer power into the hands of the workers on the shop floor, the union bureaucracy with the Biden administration suppressed the vote. Nevertheless, Will won 5,000 votes. Now, it has also become clear that the installation of UAW President Shawn Fain, after decades of criminality and revolts by rank and file auto workers, was critical for Biden's growing economic conflict with China, in which the issue of EVs and the conflict of China and war plays an outsized role. But the Biden administration also thought that the UAW bureaucracy would play a critical role in bolstering the Democratic candidate, particularly in places like Michigan. But this, in fact, backfired. The UAW handed $1.5 million to the Democratic National Committee. It sent out 5,000 votes. It claimed that this campaign would be centered on the interests of the working class. But the UAW and Shawn Fain in particular are so discredited for signing contracts in 2023, which have allowed the firing of thousands of temporary workers, the laying off of thousands and thousands of auto workers at Stellantis and GM and Ford. So discredited is the UAW bureaucracy that many workers were totally turned off by Harris because of the aggressive campaign by the UAW bureaucracy. As one Toledo Jeep worker who's just been laid off told us, the UAW is hammering jobs, and Fain was out hosting rallies for Harris. His last 2 live streams were supposed to be discussing a possible strike against Stellantis. Instead, they were Harris rallies. We got no answers. Fain doesn't even mention the layoffs. If you read the comments, everyone was angry and wanted answers. The fact that they treated us like fools made even more people decide not to vote for Harris, to be honest. My guess was Fain got promised a position in Harris's cabinet. It was another phony sellout. Now, of course, the Trump administration exploited the complete indifference of the Democratic Party, the betrayals of the trade union bureaucracy in order to gain power. But he is now setting and embarking on a course for social counter-revolution. It's very significant that his appointment for Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, cut her political teeth as a Labor Department official in the Reagan administration, which fired 13,000 air traffic controllers in 1981 and smashed their union, which gutted occupational safety and health and mine safety and health. No, and notwithstanding the phony claims to be a champion of workers' interests, the Trump administration plans to lift any restrictions on the exploitation of the working class and its extraction of profits from the labor of workers. Elon Musk's threats to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget and impose, quote, hardship on the population is going to provoke mass opposition. Already there are voices in the political establishment that the cost of total war will mean gutting Social Security, Medicare, public education, and other things that workers consider their basic social rights. Already some 27 state governments are saying they are facing an impending financial crisis, blaming this on so-called unsustainable pension obligations. Trump proposes to abolish the Department of Education, have unlimited school vouchers, the elimination of federal funding for low-income schools. This takes place under conditions in which the public school districts around the country are already in crisis because Biden cut the federal or allowed the expiration of the COVID school funding. Some 380,000 educators face the axe all across the country. Schools in Chicago, Milwaukee, San Francisco, and other cities are being shut. He plans to privatize the post office. And there are already signs of growing opposition. Two teacher strikes erupted in the Boston area earlier this week. A third could start this week. teachers in Albany, Oregon, are set to strike this Tuesday. Now, the Trump administration intends to carry out a very different policy than Biden. He is seeking to carry out a fascist movement to violently destroy any means through which workers can fight. That is, he doesn't trust the trade union bureaucracy to contain the growing explosive movement of the working class. And he intends to seek to build a mass fascistic movement of disoriented sections, certainly, and crushed sections of the middle class, disoriented sections of the working class, to violently suppress the class struggle. His Project 2025, it presents the aim is to strip workers of any democratic rights, any right to organize. They intend to recategorize workers as, quote, independent contractors, contingent employees, entrepreneurs with no protections, no right to organize, and vulnerable to be fired at any point. Just one analysis of Project 25 said they plan to ban unions for public service workers. They want to allow corporations to eliminate collective bargaining agreements in mid-contract. They want to let companies stop paying overtime, allow states to opt out of federal overtime and minimum wage laws. They want to eliminate child labor productions. And they want to carry out J.D. Vance's bill to let employers create their own company unions. And this takes place as an increasing number of jobs are being gutted, as the policies carried out by the Federal Reserve to drive up interest rates to try to beat back the demands of workers for wages to meet up with the cost of living. There have now, in September alone, 1.8 million layoffs and discharges, an increase of more than 250,000 from the year before. Toledo Jeep, Warren Truck, Ford Rouge Electric Vehicle Center, GM Fairfax, the Sumitomo Tire Plant in Western New York, the Thompson Cabinet Plant. All of these places have eliminated thousands of jobs or are, in fact, shutting plants. And this is part of a worldwide assault on the working class, and it really demands the development of an international response of the working class. The International Workers Alliance of Rank and File Committees issued a statement late last month to develop a global campaign against the destruction of jobs which are taking place at Volkswagen in Germany, tens of thousands of jobs cuts, Nissan, 9,000 job cuts, and job cuts throughout the world. But this means a rejection of the nationalism of the trade union bureaucracies, which are all cozying up to Trump on the basis of anti-Chinese tariffs. And it means developing within the working class, as it comes into struggle, those forms which are independent of the union bureaucracy, which give expression to the strivings of the working class to defend its class interests, and which unite the working class across national borders. Now, if you would go to the next slide. Actually, if you go to the slide, there you go. I think it's worth noting that the eruption of class struggle that occurred in the first Trump administration, it began with a series of wildcat strikes by educators, starting in the coal fields of West Virginia. It then went to Oklahoma. The next slide, if you would. We can't quite see the sign the young lady on the left had, but these were revolts against the trade union bureaucracy. She had the sign on the left actually said, "This movement didn't start with the OEA," that's the Oklahoma Education Association, "and it's not going to end with the OEA." These were an upheaval of educators in areas where the union bureaucracy had the weakest grip. The next slide, if you would, it spread to Arizona. In the following year, it spread to Los Angeles in 2019. And these were a first sign of an immense opposition exploding on the question of the defense of public education, on the reality sinking in to millions of educators that this capitalist system has no future to provide the students that they teach, except for low-paid jobs and for war. And this movement began in the next slide, if you would, very significantly in 2020 when COVID first hit and the Trump administration tried to use the War Production Act to block workers or force workers to continue to work inside of COVID-infected factories. A whole series of strikes broke out among auto workers in Toledo, in Windsor, in Detroit, in Italy. And then this developed into mass struggles of healthcare workers. That's what this slide shows. All over the world, the claims that these workers were heroes, that by the political establishment, was followed by massive attacks on healthcare workers. Increasingly, many workers holding signs, patients before profits, in which it becomes increasingly clear that a political establishment, a capitalist class all over the world that was willing to sacrifice millions of people's lives for corporate profit during the pandemic was continuing this as educators, healthcare workers, and other sections of workers came into struggle after the supposed end of the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic continues to this day. Now, just to try to underscore the points that Comrade Dave made, the central political question is the fight to develop within the working class of a politically conscious vanguard that will take into the broader sections of workers a political understanding of what the working class confronts, that fascism arises out of the decay and degeneration of capitalism itself, that democratic rights are incompatible with a capitalist system which is plunging mankind into World War III, which upholds such levels of social inequality. It is not possible for an oligarchy to conduct its antisocial policies on the basis of democratic consensus. It can only impose these undemocratically and through authoritarian measures. And the explosive movements of the working class, which are going to emerge, have to be politically guided. They have to be politically independent of the Democratic Party and of all capitalist politics. And they have to be guided by an understanding that the only way that fascism and war and inequality can be stopped is through the working class taking political power in its own hands and reorganizing society throughout the world on the basis of socialism. If you go to some of the final slides, if you could. In the election campaign of Comrade Joseph Kishore and myself, we have consistently intervened within the working class. This first slide is the struggle of auto workers against factory layoffs. The next slide, if you would. We intervened among workers at the Eaton Aerospace, where presently this giant corporation is bringing in scab replacements in the home state of the UAW, and the UAW bureaucracy is doing nothing. The next slide. We discussed and intervened among the Boeing workers, and here, as this photograph shows, completely undermines the nationalist and anti-immigrant chauvinism of that's being peddled by Trump. On the picket lines in the state of Washington, there were workers from virtually every country on the planet. And this demonstrated that whatever ethnic, national backgrounds, gender backgrounds, what unites the working class is its common class interests. The essential issue, just to conclude, is that we anticipate massive explosion of class conflict. The working class will not allow itself to be thrown back more than a century. There will be massive opposition, but the Socialist Equality Party is fighting to build the revolutionary leadership to guide this emerging movement with an understanding of what its historic tasks are. And that is why what we fought for in this election campaign, the Socialist Equality Party will continue and deepen its fight to build this revolutionary leadership to unite the working class internationally in the fight for socialism.
Okay, well, we've had now a series of very comprehensive reports. What follows from all that you've heard today is a decision that you have to make. We are on the precipice of profound changes in the political situation within the United States and internationally. And if there's any point which really has to be underscored, is that the conditions we've described in the United States are by no means unique. First of all, the election itself, as we said before, is a global event. The crisis in the United States is one that reverberates throughout the world. Last week, explaining the title, the American earthquake, I actually referred to a volcano, mixing metaphors, of Mount Krakatoa. The volcano in the Indian Ocean sent off shock waves that were heard as far away as Britain, 6,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 miles away. Right now in the press of the world, it is dominated by the election in the United States, trying to work out what its implications are. The growth of right-wing fascistic movements is not an exclusively American phenomena. The same process is visible in Germany with the AfD, in Italy with Meloni, who represents a fascist party, in France, the growth of the Le Pen movement. This is an international process, or in Argentina with Milei. And it's an international process because capitalism is international. We live in the epoch of the transnational corporation, which exploits labor on a global scale. And to understand that also provides an insight into the reality and necessity of an international perspective. And this is what is of the most critical importance to the working class. We must counter to the transnational global perspective of American imperialism the international unity of the working class. The struggles of the working class in this epoch must be, by the very nature, of an international character. Trump and his MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, proposes a return to some sort of mythical past, a United States protected by its national borders from all outsiders. In fact, the United States is part of a global economy, and its own policies are driven by a desperate effort to maintain its dominance in the global economy. But there can be no return to the national hearth. What, after all, is the nature of production in our epoch? It's international, it's global. Production chains are international. It is impossible to establish the national identity of any product. Every time you use your cell phone, you have in your hand a commodity that is the product of an international division of labor. In fact, objectively, in their daily lives, in the products they use, in the processes of labor they participate in, workers are connected to their class brothers and sisters all over the world. And this fundamental truth must form the basis of a new strategy of working class struggle. And that is, I think, the most important element of the program that the Socialist Equality Party advances. We don't have a national strategy, we have an international strategy. Now we come to the most vital question: what you must do. We urge you very carefully to think through the issues we've raised, to study the World Socialist website, to read our literature, but then decide on what your relationship is to the great historical questions of our time. There is an objective need for a revolutionary socialist movement, but the building of such a movement is the product of the decisions that people make to intervene in the historical process, to subordinate their lives to the needs of humanity as a whole. Right now, as we speak, we have a comrade in Ukraine who has conducted a struggle to build a movement to unite Ukrainian and Russian workers in a common struggle against the oligarchs of both countries. He is in prison. He's being held on charges of treason. And the principal basis of that allegation is that he has written for the World Socialist website. His prosecutors are quoting extensively from the WSWS. I want to also point out to you that you should go to wsws.org/freebogdan and sign the petition and help us make this case as widely known as possible. And finally, we are asking you to very seriously consider joining the Socialist Equality Party, taking up the fight to build this movement in the working class, among youth. This is the necessary task which must be taken forward to meet the challenges of the coming period. Now, I regret that we're not able to answer the many questions which have come in. We will publish a number of these answers and we will reply to them as best we can. We've run considerably over time at this point, but all of the questions really are oriented to the same basic issue. Is it possible to build a movement? What must be done to fight the danger of fascism? Can fascism be defeated? I hope that we have addressed these issues. And I just want to inform you that in the weeks ahead, we will continue to hold a series of webinars which will address these very issues. They will be devoted specifically to the question of the fight to defend democratic rights, the significance of the socialist program, the question of international policy in the fight against war, the economic crisis. In other words, we want to develop the necessary political movement on the basis of a deeper understanding of the political problems that we confront, to understand these in objective terms, and to provide on that basis a perspective that can guide the inevitable struggles that will develop. Of that, we have no doubt whatsoever. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, we've had a very, very good viewership. I believe that at least on some of the social media sites, it's well over 2,000. Perhaps it's even more. And I know that these events have a significant afterlife. They will be viewed by many, many thousands more. And at any rate, please do everything you can to inform your workmates, your friends, fellow students, family members of what we have discussed, and have them view this event as well. Thank you very much.